Greetings, welcome to the Transforming Assessment webinar series for the 4th of August. Today's session is Object-Based Learning for Digital Assessment. Michael from Australian Catholic University will be our presenter for today. So Michael, would you like to begin, please?
Certainly. Well, first, thank you to Professor Crisp and Dr Hillier for the opportunity to participate in what I consider to be a very exciting part of discussion around transforming assessment. The presentation this morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you're from, comes out of a recently funded ACU teaching development grant, which was entitled Retention and Engagement with regard to object-based learning and interactive history. And I've drawn together some of those results as well as some other thoughts on object-based learning for digital assessment. So realistically, my objective is twofold. First, I want to explore the rationale of object-based learning for digital assessment, and hence the title. But then I also want to provide some specific examples linked to specific learning outcomes at the assessment unit and course level of the particular programs that I at least work within the university. And the hope is that that will encourage, perhaps incrementally, perhaps slightly more, but a viable context for the application of this object-based learning for our collective endeavours. The overall motivation for this trajectory really is the way in which I envision the engagement and interpretation of our world in different phases. And I sort of adopt this concept from Andy Crouch, but he talks about there being a three-phase dimension to engagement, and he sketches in the first instance the era of orality, which was when the most culturally significant information was communicated and passed from one generation to another in the form of oral traditions, stories, and that was how the most significant material was passed on. Second phase he identifies as the age of literacy, where most significant information was written down and oral information became secondary. The third stage he identifies, and this is where he sees it terminating, as well, at least at that point he was writing, as significant information communicated visually, perhaps incorporating speech and writing as well, but maybe focused on still or moving images. But I'm proposing a fourth stage to this trajectory, and that is interactivity. That is that as a culture moves from orality to literacy to visualcy, and then I'm suggesting to interactivity, people engage and they communicate in that process of information transmission and formation through that interactive. Now, without getting into too many details of any kind of prognostication, I perhaps would anticipate that the fifth stage, which I don't think we're at yet, is the element of participation, a fully immersive participation in that context. But we're not talking about that today. I'm going to be talking about this what I see as the fourth stage, that of interactivity. So that's the sort of broader context. In terms of the practical elements here, what I saw as developments in the areas of digital imaging, visualization systems that are now very easily accessible through a standard desktop, a tablet, a mobile device, or really any kind of computer at all, really enables this creation of a really compelling interactive virtual worlds and indeed virtual objects. And I won't go through these technical specifics of the method that at least I used for one of the objects, but it's relatively straightforward. I mean, the object on the screen now is a Hasmonean oil lamp from the 2nd century BCE, and I use the freeware and my mobile phone to create a 3D image that was able to be navigated by a user, by a student, for the purposes of a particular integration of that object into a learning activity and exercise. And so overall, I won't look at the technical aspects, although I'm very happy to talk about those afterwards. But my intent was to try and engage and enhance and support and maybe even inspire students through the integration of objects that they can interact with. And that's where the focus was. Now, my own teaching area is in the area of theology and ancient languages, Greek and Hebrew, Latin, and so on. But I anticipate and I propose to you that the results of that project and the wider methodological approach can be readily adapted and beneficially applied to a full range of disciplinary offerings in the tertiary sector, at least, and maybe other sectors also. I think the results speak for themselves, which I'll get to in just a moment, but not only was a performance metric brought up, but there are other pleasing beneficial aspects of this, which we saw a reduction of attrition rates, a boost in student levels of engagement, the performance element, which I'll get to in a moment, but also comments, both qualitative and quantitative, which we'll get to also in the learning process, which students self-reported themselves, the material being more interesting, more efficient in terms of the scope of material covered, and also the enjoyment of that interactivity. And now that's not to say that there aren't disadvantages. I've reflected on that a fair bit and have come up with a fairly long list of disadvantages, but I still am convinced that the advantages outweigh those disadvantages. And we can get to those disadvantages later on, but just to flag some, sometimes with object-based learning, there can be higher attentional demands of the participant, which might result in them ignoring potentially other parts of the experience to their detriment. There's some inefficiency in terms of time. I think it's an investment of time rather than inefficiency, but just like any context, one has to weigh the time that is expended with the result that's produced. And I found, at least in this particular project, that the results themselves justified and commended the time that was required. And also the other slight difficulty is what you do with the different levels of student in terms of their what kind of achiever they are, low, average, or high, and how that can be adapted. But I found a way, particularly in the language classes with ancient Greek, of finding ways to use objects in a way that actually catered to those three levels quite nicely. So the literature reviews that you'll read often highlight that as a potential downfall, but I found actually that could easily be flipped to a positive. So we'll get to some of those as we go around and through the material. Now, the basic idea of object-based learning in terms of the background to it is that our human minds, our brains, process information rather than simply just respond to it. And that's the case, I understand, from my literature review of the neuroscientists, with both the long-term memory and the short-term memory, that we process information rather than simply respond to it. And to use a colleague's example, if you took a picture like this, and in terms of unpacking this response or process, if this item on the left, very left-hand side of the screen, if that was if I told you that was a little tree, then the next item across in the center of the slide, you'd probably say, well, that's a big tree. And the group of items on the far right-hand side of the slide are a forest or something like that. But if I changed the specific of the data, as it were, the information that I was providing you, and that object on the left-hand side was a child, then the item to the right is now not a big tree or even a closer tree, as Matthew perhaps suggested. That's a good one, but is comparatively, in the context of the image, is an adult, and therefore the image on the collection of pixels, blackened pixels on the right-hand side, is the not a forest but a family. So you can have, in terms of the example here, you can have the same pixels on the screen, the same data, which presents information, but the information, i.e. whether it's a tree, a child, or something else, is different. And the understanding, i.e. putting that information together to conclude that this is a forest or a family or something else, is how you use that information to create knowledge. And so these things all aren't the same. They're our minds that are actively processing the information that we give it. So when it comes to memory, Alan Pavio argues that the human mind has separate verbal and visual, i.e. image mechanisms. So when information is encountered in either form, verbal or visual, it's coded and stored as such, i.e. verbal or visual memory. And that's helpful in one sense, but the downside is that polarization of memory type can result in the flooding of one or other of those types of memory, verbal or written memory. And so for that reason, when we come to think about the way in which we absorb information or we process information, it's helpful to think of both the visual and the verbal. So Linda Law explores this in a paper that's entitled Creating Graphics for Learning and Performance, that effectively is about visual theory, which I have learnt a lot from over the years. And it's not just in regard to graphical images, but also of shape and color and texture and space and value and pattern and contrast and the full spectrum of elements there. And in another paper, Law and Gall demonstrates a connection between the visual excuse me, and the verbal codes, and in so doing actually strengthens the memory. So that's really important, because if you can use both and, one will then strengthen the other, and that's referred to as dual coding. So presenting the combination of the visual and the verbal information increases recognition, recall, because it strengthens the association that's afforded by that process of dual coding. And those have to obviously be done in parallel and done carefully for that positive effect. So what then do we mean in regard to object-based learning? Well, it's obviously a student-centered learning approach, which some people would consider to be a good thing. I consider that to be a good thing. It uses objects, and these objects can be very, very small. For instance, ancient coins is something that I often have introduced students to in this process, or it could be an entire building, like this example here, the Pantheon in Rome. Now, I haven't got across to Rome recently for obvious reasons, but when I have taken students across on study trips and things like that, it is an object, just a very large object that we are experiencing as a group. And those objects are brought into the learning environment, or we are brought into it in the case of the Pantheon, And that can be physically, and that's ideally, I think, the best possible thing, because you also then have the kinesthetic element or the tactile element that you may not be able to capture digitally, although there's some other material that might help with that. And what it does then is that uses multiple sensors, including this idea of dual coding, or even beyond that, depending on the sensors, as ways to help promote and engage the student in that learning activity and engagement. And so the real benefit is that these things are objects. And certainly for my area, as I teach and research in the area of theology and philosophy, that these elements, the association of those elements with the abstract concepts that are dealt with in the lectures or in the textbook material, written type words, helps strengthen and expand and concretize the aspects of the material that are under discussion. It makes things real, and this is not just an intuition, which is the case, but also bears out in the literature as well. Also, the one major benefit, of course, is that the object itself stimulates the mind of the learner, and especially their imagination. Helps them to take a series of problems or context of one problem and apply it more broadly. And so this idea of using an object, whether small or large, to strengthen and lead and inspire and unpack the imagination is something that is both intuitive and, I think, demonstrated in actual practice, which we'll get to. Active learning constructs meaning through interactions. It relates to abstract context, but it also enables this visualization, and that's a key dimension in the process. So why don't I give you an example of one way that this has been done in my own work. Well, as you might imagine, just like cities today vie for prestige and privilege, whether it's hosting an Olympic Games or whether it's a way of boasting of the tallest or best or something or other, whatever it might be, it was not different to the ancient world when there were claims about cities wanting to give themselves the best kind of status or privileged position in the ancient world. And so here we have an inscription from a place called Priene. This is on the western coast of modern-day Turkey, ancient Asia Minor, and it basically announces the intention of this city to change their calendar so that it basically honors the Roman Emperor Augustus, and that it refers to Augustus in various ways. It refers to Augustus as the bringer of good tidings, the Evangelion, which is the same word, in fact, that's used for the gospel in early Christian literature. And it also refers to Augustus as its sotir, or its savior, using the common verbiage of Roman propaganda to portray and honor that particular individual, Augustus. So when a learner encounters an inscription like this, whether it's in a museum or whether it's as a 3D object that can be manipulated and engaged with and interacted with, or whether it's a decent, high resolution image or a photocopy, all of that is in essence trying to work towards this idea of an object for the basis of investigation. And you can see here, and we don't have to read Greek, although I know that our colleagues over in Europe are more likely to have done some ancient Greek even in their secondary studies, at least more so than the possibility of that in Australia. But nonetheless, for those that are studying any dimension of the ancient world, seeing a text in its original, i.e. written on a stone or inscribed upon a stone with different letter shapes, with no spaces, limited punctuation, difficulty in reading, perhaps a letter. It's very unlike the experience of reading a printed text as you might pick up a critical edition. And of interest here is that, again, as I mentioned before, I've got some of the verbiage there for you to see in translation on the left, where that Augustus is identified as a savior, as he's identified as one who makes an epiphany, i.e. an appearance, and one that brings good tidings, that brings the good news, literally the same word that's used for the good news or the gospel. So this can be applied and be done for small objects as well. So this is a coin of Hippostratos. And you can see here I've highlighted the name, which runs in a counterclockwise direction, and that's the name Hippostratos. It just happens to be in a genitive case, hence the O and Y, or Omicron Epsilon ending. And I've used this as a way to communicate to students very tangibly, not just about case endings and so on, but the language itself. So as we go through and continue to read, the blue text there is Vasileos, so it's a word for king, and then Megalou, that's the great king, and then also Sotiros, the genitive of the word for savior, sotir, in Greek. And so again, this coin is celebrating Hippostratus as one who is the great king and the savior. And of course, it's a very easy step for students to understand, say, for instance, a genitive case, and all these nouns are in the genitive in Greek, if they're literally holding a coin and they understand that a coin, it belongs to someone in the sense of that is issued by a king, but it also belongs to someone as it's someone's property, possession, so it's in their pocket. And it's very hard to forget those types of learning experiences when you're physically holding a coin which is over 2,000 years old, as you are learning about, say, the realities of the Roman world, politically, economically, or even linguistically, if one is investigating that, because of that very strong connection between the dual core, the verbal dimension and the visual dimension. Now, if you were to add the tactile dimension, I wouldn't suggest eating a coin unless it's a chocolate coin, but if you add other senses to it, then you again strengthen the experience and therefore the richness of the learning experience for the student. And so I could talk about coins for well over our time allotted today, but again, you have different ways and different verbiage, emphases on this material. And this is a coin of Zoilos, and he's also 1st century BCE, 55 to 35 BC, and talks about using similar language also. So where does this all go? Yes, okay, you can talk about that in terms of its in and of itself, and you can assess that by asking students to identify or investigate or comment upon, and I'll give you a list of ways that some might want to do that. But you can also approach it from a textual point of view, where you look at a particular lexeme in say an ancient text, and you use that then as a comparative model for related objects. And so you might have, like you do here in an early Christian text, the book of Acts of the Apostles, that there's this statement that the followers of Jesus were running around and they never stopped teaching, proclaiming the good news. That word, good news, is exactly the same word in a different verbal form, that's a participle there, but evangelizome is the same word as evangelizo. That was attributed to what Augustus was doing, and that inscription and those coins and other things like that are, of course, dated well before the time that the book of the Acts of the Apostles was written. And same with this idea of a savior. The savior, it's hard to undo the baggage, mental baggage that that people might bring to, say, reading a text like the book of Acts, because the word savior has specific religious connotations, perhaps, to both modern, well, to modern ears. But in fact, in the ancient world, it didn't necessarily have anything to do with some kind of elaborate religious system. It's just somebody that saved you from some danger. And because Augustus had done that through various means in the traditions of Asia Minor, he was regarded and honoured as a saviour. So the early Christian literature seems to be intentionally using titles that are attributed to leaders, rival leaders like Augustus and Nero and so on, and apply them directly to their main figure, in this case Jesus. And their proclamation effectively then is, it's not Augustus, not Nero or Hippostratus or Zoilos or some other person that's that has delivered us from some danger, but it is Jesus, and they attribute that. But that's political language. That is language that is immersed in Roman propaganda. It's not a soteriological dimension that they're seeking to highlight. And again, because of particular interest in coins, but coins are so spectacular in their iconography and also the epigraphic dimension. So you could take a coin like this. This is a 2nd century BCE coin of Antiochus Epiphanes, the Epiphanes IV. And again, you could read Basileos Antiochou, so King Antiochus, Theou Epiphanos, God manifest. This Antiochus did not struggle with any kind of self-esteem issues. He really saw himself as the one that was manifesting divinity, and he was the one that was bringing victory, Nikephoru. And then there's also a depiction of Zeus and Nike, the gods, and then a mint mark with the E. So all of that to say that we have in this background of material, we have copperanda that are relevant not just to the cultural context and the iconographic world, but then you have that, of course, specifically in relation to the way in which this language is used in other contemporaneous, although slightly later literature, like the book of the letter to Titus or 2 Timothy or other things like that, and provides a very tangible connection. So you could take a step back and like I normally do when engaging with students, and ask larger questions, meta questions about what the function of these inscriptions are, and this is where you engage the imagination of the participant, and also digging a bit deeper to ask, well, what exactly would such an inscription serve? How would it serve state ideology? And then also without sort of drawing the lines too closely or the dots too closely for the participants, the students, asking them the leading question to where I really want to get to, and that is, well, what light interpretively or hermeneutically do these texts, inscriptions, and likewise provide for us in terms of reading other texts? And so there's a whole, you could effectively do an entire course. We could easily do an entire course on this material-based cultural aspects where students are fully immersed in that area. Sometimes there are difficult challenges in reading particular texts. I won't go into this into too much detail because I want to get through the other elements as well. Plus, I've got a quiz for you guys to see if you can do it a little bit of this stuff yourself. But for instance, just very briefly, this is a story in the Gospel of Mark, written at about 70 CE, and Jesus is on trial. He is questioned in Mark whether he is in fact the Messiah, and he says yes. Plus, I am. I'm the Son of Man, and I sit at the right hand, and I'm coming on the clouds of heaven. A Messiah is just basically a title of a king. But we hear in this text that people think that he's committed blasphemy, and that's problematic, of course, because the penalty for blasphemy is death. And you might say, well, what's blasphemous about claiming to be the king? People need a king. That's part of their political structures. So, well, part of the dimension of this that if we had more time would explore, but I'll just briefly mention, is that texts from the ancient Near Eastern background identify the cloud rider as the storm god, Baal, and so you can read about this all in Ugaritic texts. And so what the Jewish scriptures do with that designation of Baal as the one who is the cloud rider, or the thunder god, or the one who brings the rain, is it takes that title, cloud rider, and applies it to their God, Yahweh, or the God of the Hebrew Bible. And so you get in the prophets and the Psalms that it is God himself who is riding on the clouds, who's the cloud rider, not this Baal figure, which is here is a 3D interactive little model that I've used for students in that respect as well. So when you bring that back into via the prophetic literature of ancient Israel, where's the Son of Man who comes on the clouds, then what Jesus is saying here during his trial makes sense in terms of why people consider it blasphemy, because God is the only one apparently who rides on clouds, i.e. it came from the language initially being presented to or describing Baal, and then to Yahweh, or the God of Israel, and then to this figure, Son of Man, and then Jesus seems to be drawing on that, and that's why the high priest rips his clothes and condemns Jesus to death, because he's committed blasphemy. So there's that background as well. So in terms of engagement with the actual objects themselves, it's very easy and accessible for students. I've used in the past MeshLab, which is a free open source software package that can view and process 3D models, normally in the OBJ file type. And the good thing about this is it's available for most platforms, including Linux, Mac, Windows, or whatever, and also on the phones. Without giving another 10 examples, but there's a very rich possibility of backgrounds for integration of that. And so one dimension of this, of course, which has been particularly helpful during the time of separation, physical separation from students, has been the ability to conduct and integrate those physical objects, or those digital objects that are based on physical objects, obviously, from collections in a way that is helpful and drawing on those positive dimensions. Ideally, in person, face to face, the tactile nature of the experience is beneficial. But if not, then we have other ways, of course, with this 3D imaging that could easily do that. The basic outlines of how I've done it in the past is 3 different steps with teaching with objects: describe, classify, and interpret. And I've tried to align these with Bloom's taxonomy and also other descriptors at different levels or phases of the learning process. But in a nutshell, describe, classify, and interpret is the way in which I've operated in the past. So again, this could be done with those big objects, or even objects without any text. And so, for example, when just thinking about how object-based learning could take many forms, in order to have students explore the way in which Rome used the Pantheon and indeed the forums in the ancient period, and there's I guess correlatives to this in the modern world as well, and not just in Rome, but it used those central public places as a centripetal trophy room, showing off the treasures that effectively they'd plundered from the world in a propagandistic sense. I introduced the students to the types of marble and have them dispersed throughout, say, the Roman Forum, to actually find and describe as many different marble types as possible in situ. And then I can, through digital means, allow them to electronically play with the marble, and it ends up, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the book series Where's Wally, but it's sort of like the Where's Wally of marble. And effectively they're armed with this list of 15 major types of marble, and they're encouraged to go off and explore within the several acres of the Roman Forum where they might find these items and what function they may have had. And that's simply something that they'll never forget. It's something also that can be easily examined, and it's not just regurgitation. It feels like and ticks all the boxes for deep learning, and learning that is intuitive and interactive. So now I've got a test for you. So get ready to type if you'd like to. First item, what is this? And in the chat, if you could type in the number 1 and then whatever you think this might be: child's doll, perfume flask, scissors case, medicine bottle, or souvenir spoon. Okay, we've got D's and B's. That's good. Maybe an A. But the great thing about exactly what's happening in your mind now is that you're trying to make sense of this item that's in front of you. No, we can't touch it. We can't investigate it. We can't smell it. We can't, physically inspect it. But of course, digitally manipulating it might give you some additional information. In fact, it is a perfume flask and applicator, and is made out of ivory and comes from the 14th century BC. It was actually discovered in a burnt temple in the Canaanite city of Lachish, and you can even still see some of the burn marks around the bottom of the skirting area. And yes, it has, Lorraine, that very distinctive blue, which is just a beautiful, vivid colour. And so those kinds of experiences, you think, well, hang on a minute, why on earth was a perfume flask applicator found in, burnt in and underneath a temple in the 14th century BC? I mean, your imagination then is engaged and is taken off and goes further. Now, I won't go through the 5 examples, but I did have some others to show you here. Depending on your familiarity with this, this is actually it's D. It's a game board, and I won't go into details there. For those that are listening to this later, you can pause and wonder. This is a cosmetic applicator. These are castanets, and this is, where are we? There we go. This is, in fact, a mace head, and there's a lot of other ways that we could engage with that. So now, just to draw some of these items together, because I do want us to have some time for questions and discussion, I really benefited from this book by Warren Berger. It's called entitled A More Beautiful Question. And Berger's findings are really interesting in that he finds that in terms of the questions that are asked, children at the age of 1, 2, 3, And 4 ask lots of questions. In fact, 4 years of age is the time apparently when humans ask the most questions, up to 390 questions a day. And as someone that has a 4-year-old child that lives in our home, I can attest to that. It's effectively a question every 2 minutes of your waking day. And unfortunately, Berger then explores the disappointing scenario where from 4 years old and onwards, the number of questions per day are set on this downward trajectory. And we see the result of that in schools, primary, secondary, and then into tertiary education, where questions are hammered out of students, and rather what we're looking for are answers. And I really like what the French rhetorician and philosopher Voltaire once said, in that he suggested that people should be judged on the questions that they ask rather than the answers that they provide. And I think that the object-based learning can really encourage this kind of inquisitiveness, even if it's a question about what on earth is that? Why is it blue? Why has it been burned? Why was it found where it was? And so on. It generates great questions, I think. Well, does it actually work? My interest really in this particular project that I undertook was in 3 metrics: retention, engagement, and performance. And I'll present the basic findings on the performance dimension on a group of 98 students that I had in 2 different sessions, and they participated in this voluntarily, and it was fascinating to see the results. The basic scenario of it, in a nutshell, is that I narrated an overview of the sort of like a history of ancient Israel and early Christianity in 7 stages. And then I tested for specific details after a period of a break, and then also after a longer break. And I was pleasantly surprised to see that the questions that were asked, I have details of those, of the different groups. So effectively I had different groups, and then I collated the results of those individuals within those groups, and then analysed the patterns that emerged from the smaller sample set. But effectively, the students that had no kind of other stimulus apart from the verbal or written word, compared to those that had annotated images, digital interaction, and tactile contact, you can see the percentage of students that that were able to answer the questions accurately, significantly rose when you go from yellow to orange. The orange, of course, is the object-based learning groups, and the yellow are the single coded information, which was, perhaps not unsurprising, but it was very interesting to see it playing out right in front of my eyes. The other positive thing in this respect was the quantitative student feedback, in terms of 100% of the 98 students either indicated agree or strongly agree on the questionnaire afterwards regarding increasing interest, the level of engagement, the aid of retention, the inspired dimension of wanting to learn more, and then also the ability to connect different disparate bits of information with a broader scope. So there's a quantitative, but the qualitative feedback was also very encouraging. I'll give you just a small selection, but it was overwhelmingly positive in terms of highlighting how it helped them understand the dates and the connection of those elements to engage, inspire, etc. So really, in conclusion, the object-based learning capacity, when it came to the graduate attributes of encouraging critical thought, and also demonstrating knowledge and skills, and also the potential of solving problems, as well as the course learning outcomes and also the assessment outcomes, but I won't go through those, really were highlighted as very much met and exceeded through this process of incorporating object-based learning. And there are, of course, many dimensions to this, and maybe this will come out in some of our discussion, but those positives, especially in the way it was used as a metric for assessment, and the way that that was brought into the examination, was this is subsequent to the trial that the data set that I showed you before was based upon, was very positively received. And there was a significant jump in terms of performance of students when more emphasis was put on object-based learning, integrating that in. Now, there are some downsides to that in terms of the time taken, the structure of it, and so on. But there were ways that a group of us were able to think around that, hopefully in a productive way. So I'd be very interested in the in comments and questions and feedback or thoughts as I continue to mould my own thoughts around the usefulness of object-based learning for tertiary education within my discipline, but also applying that to other disciplines. I'd be interested to hear about how and where maybe you find connections in your own field and work. So thank you very much, and I'll hand back over to Matthew now for his moderation.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. If anybody has questions, you may type them into the text chat, or you may put up your virtual hand, as in the button in the bottom center of the screen, and then you might like to ask your question via the microphone. So that's just 2 options. Questions, anybody? Michael Rampy's here. He's a colleague from Macquarie. He might like to say something about the work he's been doing with object-orientated stuff as well. If you'd like to say something, Michael, that's just an option for you if you want.
Yeah, sure. Look, thanks so much for the talk, Michael. It's really interesting to see what you're doing at ACU. But you spoke about using MeshLab, which is obviously a standalone piece of freeware. What's the main barrier for scaling this in online education, especially?
Yeah, I've thought about that a little bit, and I'd be interested for your own thoughts as well. I mean, the upside, of course, of having them in that framework is accessibility, and we know that all universities are going to be interested in that, and making museum collections which are obscure, out of reach, a long way away, fragile, or whatever it might be, accessible to those that are studying in an online capacity. That's very attractive. The downside to it is that there's nothing quite like the actual engagement, almost like a spiritual experience of holding in your hands that object, whether it's an oil lamp inscription or a coin or something like that. And it almost feels, having taught several over 12, 13 years ago at Macquarie in the Ancient Culture Museum in the summer school there, that kind of the moment of qualia, the existential kind of engagement with the object is the thing that really reinforces, and something chemically must happen differently in the brain. And it's very difficult to extricate yourself from the memory of that, because it's such a significant experience. So it may be, in terms of the digital stuff and the using MeshLab or another platform, even Adobe, obviously there's different things you can do there. In terms of how I've used those elements for object-based learning, they all, in my mind, deliver the same kind of experience. The thing that is the addition to, in terms of a barrier for object-based learning, is that even though we can get fantastically detailed visualizations of these objects, there's nothing quite like actually engaging with the object itself that can substitute. There's an old Jewish saying that reading the Bible in translation is like kissing your bride through the veil. And it sort of has that sense that, this is a veiled experience, even though it is a beautiful experience to be able to navigate those items digitally. There's nothing quite like the tangibility of something like that. But how about yourself? What do you think?
Look, I agree 100%, and we have this conversation. I've heard that exact conversation many times. So we ended up developing a platform for online learning with 3D objects at Macquarie, with that museum you referred to, over the last sort of seven or 8 years. And I really, in the online space, I like to talk about, rather than replace the physical, what we're actually doing is replacing a photograph. So we're replacing a photograph with a 3D version, which actually, for online students that would never get the physical anyway, you're getting closer. And I really, sometimes like to flip that argument around that, of course the real thing's better than 3D, but 3D is also better than a picture, and a picture is better than reading an article. So, just like we started today, I think on the decline of, from the described right through to the really tacit and experienced. I think what we're doing now with object-based learning is quite an interesting time, especially with museums like that. So look, I encourage you to have a look at some of the platform work we've done. It's called Pedestal. I put a link in the chat for anyone that wants to have a look.
Thank you. And so, Michael, just to clarify, so you are doing some, does that then involve 3D printing as well with that material?
We over the last 8 years, we kind of went holistically from scanning, digitizing, printing, developing web systems, integrating into teaching, really looking at that. How do you actually seriously take a teaching collection and make it available for online learning? And it's a wicked problem. It really is a wicked problem. But I think we've come quite a long way. And certainly with better computers nowadays and better bandwidth and WebGL technology, we're really at the cusp of something interesting.
Yeah, thank you for your comments and also for the link. I look forward to learning more about. I'd heard some good work that Macquarie was doing, but hadn't really connected with anyone individually. So if it's okay, I might even follow up with you at a later point on that.
Drop me a line, please. Always happy to talk, ABL.
Yeah, thank you. Matthew, are you happy for me to select some comments here,
I was going to suggest,
would you like to
there's a whole bunch of them in the chat.
Yeah.
So whichever one you think, if you can, there was one about how did you use the objects in assessment, and I'd take that as further, how have you been using it in digital assessment, and perhaps you might reflect on how, how you've managed to use or potentially use this stuff, given the pandemic has forced us away from, in a physical sense, to the online space.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I mean, because I think it does raise the pertinent context that we're in now, and shall be for some time forward. But in terms of the specific nature of it, so what, for instance, I've done specifically in regard to assessment, just as in an unseen or unknown context in which this is not my field at all, obviously, but when a medical doctor or training physician in training meets with a mock patient, and they describe symptoms, and they've got to come up with a scenario or a diagnosis for what's going on. Same with these objects. So when I've say done a language, if I'm teaching a language, will give. So I mean, there's this one on the screen at the moment, is a bulla, an impression of a seal, and it invites the same kind of discussion. So it's that level of integrating their knowledge from the course overall to then to be able to say, not only to be able to read a Paleo-Hebrew script and provide a translation, which is fairly straightforward on something like this, but also to ask questions about the iconography. Why is there an image with the wings like that, with a king that is supposed to not be making images, for example? And so it's an attempt, or it's an invitation really for students to use their creative imaginations in light of the course that's been undertaken. So it's more of a summative kind of assessment piece when they're asked to draw upon that breadth of knowledge, but it's done in a way that obviously is directly related to their studies, but not explicitly so, as it wasn't a specific case study that we may have looked at in the course. And that kind of leading question enables them to demonstrate whether they have met the learning outcomes. So interpretation: how would you apply this object to illuminate, a text? What kind of perspective, cultural, theological, or worldview perspective, does this item provide contrast and analyze that in comparison to? Or even the process by which they analyze the material itself gives a perspective on, to the extent and depth of their own engagement. And I guess the implications are seen then in the discussion, or their discussion, as they articulate that, say in a verbal or a written scenario, depending on what form that examination or presentation or whatever takes place. So I'm not sure, Gray, if that answered all your it certainly wasn't exhaustive, but it's some thoughts around that. Lorraine, you mentioned how hard is it for a novice to make the objects. Well, if I'm anything to go by, I'm a complete novice when it comes to that dimension. And like I said before, with some freeware software, PhotoScan software, I don't know if that's still going now, but open source software and a camera that is not more sophisticated than what was in my pocket, in my phone, I was able to make some really compelling 3D images that were completely, you could navigate them and interact with them in a really impressive way. Now, of course, if you use the top of the line digital SLR with more computing power, I'm sure, obviously, you could get archival quality renditions of the material. But for me, over the last 5 years or 6 years, or however long it's been a real joy to experiment and learn from colleagues outside my specific discipline area that can really contribute so positively to that area. So if there's any apprehension, be encouraged when I say just dive in and go for it. And so yeah, so the items there are used in the assessment, and as well as the process of leading up to the assessment. So I wouldn't normally have the same item, because then it's about the student just regurgitates whatever they've heard or seen happen in the lecture. But it's the process, the way of thinking, that helps them think through the process of illuminating or going through that material. Penny, thank you for a reference to Walter Benjamin on Aura. I'm not familiar with that, and I look forward to looking that up. I hopefully will be able to find the reference that you are referring to there. But thank you for that. And yeah, I think, Rebecca, you're and that's where my mind also went when Michael was talking. In regard, that is the other Michael, not the me Michael, but it was in terms of tangibility, and the 3D printing may be again another half step towards that area. So that's really helpful, I think. Okay, well, Matthew, shall I pass back to you?
Yes, thank you very much, Michael. This has been a great session. I'm sure it get lots of food for thought here. I certainly had the idea, when I was looking at what you were doing, I was thinking of time travel. The object, and even if you get a high res 3D renders of buildings that you can walk through with a Google Cardboard headset on or something, you kind of get
Yes.
much more of an immersive feeling of being in a space or in a museum or what have you.
Yeah.
And I think that that dimension, it's a lot easier to memorize and get understand things like spatial relationships and colors and dimensions if you're in a digitally created environment versus just reading it off linear text.
Yeah.
And the fact that you put those links between the temporal events that were happening around the same time, say for the Bible was written or previous, and you're linking that to those socio-cultural contexts, I think that's certainly a different dimension. You can see it in the objects, and how that translates through to the kind of words that are getting used in linear text and things. I think that sort of multi-dimensionality is what sort of struck me as helping me understand. I learned something today, about that. Things are written or things are of their time, right? And it's easy to forget that when you see a modern printed book or a web page, a web page with a bunch of text on it that may in fact be 2,000 years old, but you're reading it on a computer and you're thinking, and you're reading the words with the context of your modern brain and your modern social context. But in fact, you need to be thinking and understanding what it was like 2,000 years ago when it was written. And I think those objects help you to make those connections. So I think it's a really interesting way of doing teaching and learning and indeed assessment. So thank you very much. Just so the folks who are still here, the next session will be on making post-pandemic assessment authentic and interesting. A couple of great speakers from the UK, Kay Samble and Sally Brown, who've done a lot of work over the last 12, 18 months around alternative assessments in the event of the pandemic and alternatives to exams and things. So hopefully you'll be able to join us on the 1st of September for that one. But thank you very much. I shall conclude the recording now.